day for the mothers to keep their kids out of school altogether. We are white people. We don't want them to go to school with niggers. I have 5, and they're not going to school with no nigger. Good. I'm willing to go to jail every week, but I will not have my daughter go to school with a nigger.
Screaming women in New Orleans. Angry mobs in Little Rock and Levittown. Burning crosses in Mobile, Alabama. Racial violence always appears as a sudden emotional outburst, with little form or shape, save for the always common theme of hate. Hate. But actually, racial violence in our country has a long, dark history, is surprisingly patterned and predictable, and illustrates in terms no one can deny many important features of less violent racial conflict. By turning back the calendar a few generations, we see one of the most extreme forms of racial violence the world has ever witnessed, Southern lynching. Since 1882, when careful records of the phenomenon were begun, there have been over 4,700 lynch victims in the United States. That is, 4,700 Americans have been mob killed in the last 80 years. The banner headlines of our newspapers have chronicled the shocking story of the racist opposition to desegregation of public facilities in the South. Angry mobs protesting school desegregation in Clinton, Tennessee, Little Rock, and in New Orleans. The beatings and arrest of passive sit-in demonstrators and freedom riders. The bombing of public schools in Clinton, Jacksonville, Nashville, and Chattanooga. In the tragic 4-year period from 1955 through 1959 alone, well before the sit-in demonstrations of Negroes, racial violence over desegregation witnessed at least 6 Negroes killed, 29 persons shot and wounded, 18 of whom were Negro, 49 individuals beaten or stabbed, 12 churches and temples bombed or burned, and 90 private homes bombed, burned, stoned, or fired upon. Newspapers and other mass media play up these more sensational events, for these events are news and gain the attention of a usually apathetic public. But the depth of the resistance and reaction to desegregation is barely hinted at in such conspicuous episodes, for it is the less publicized, less direct, day-by-day actions of intimidation and reprisal that comprise the real pressures against racial change. The hundreds of Ku Klux Klan crosses burning ominously before the homes and churches of integrationist leaders, both black and white. The tens of thousands of threatening letters and phone calls that have been directed at those who even suggest by word or deed that they wish to cooperate with the Supreme Court desegregation ruling. The hundreds of personal slights and economic reprisals aimed against anyone who does not believe in white supremacy. These have made up the daily situation in many parts of the South, out of which have burst the publicized acts of open violence. Much of this intimidation is exerted against Negroes, who bravely seek first-class citizenship by requesting their child be transferred to an all-white school, or by trying to vote, or by moving into a previously all-white neighborhood, or by just expressing their pro-integration attitudes publicly. Such a man was Clarence Braxton, a Negro of Hoxie, Arkansas. After he had enrolled his son in a newly desegregated school, he received a letter with a clipping about Emmett Till, the young Negro who was lynched in Mississippi, and a note which read, "Your boy can get the same thing." Mr. Braxton immediately sent his son to Washington State. Or consider what happened in 1956 to a Negro couple in Choctaw County, Alabama. Mrs. Causey had told a national magazine that integration is the only way through which Negroes will receive justice. After the magazine printed her statement, Mrs. Causey lost her teaching job. Her husband's truck was confiscated. and merchants even refused to sell them anything. The causes had to be settled in another part of the South. White liberals in the South, and by the way, there are considerably more of them than most Americans realize, have often suffered a fate indistinguishable from Negro victims. Newspapermen like Ralph McGill of the Atlanta Constitution, who insist on expressing their deviant opinions in print, have learned to face death threats, even some directed at their families. Perhaps the most courageous and hence most abused white professional group in the South is the ministry. Though only a minority of even these men publicly defend racial desegregation, the ministers, priests, and rabbis who have spoken out attract special attention, for the South is a devout region which still grants considerable influence to its clergy. Consequently, the response to these outspoken men of God is often particularly vigorous. Summary dismissals of these men from their post is a common story, offering encouraging evidence that there still exists within the clergy Christians who are ready to face lions for their beliefs. But instead of my describing this phenomenon, let's bring the problem down to concrete human terms and hear firsthand the personal experiences of a native Southerner, the Reverend Dan Whitsett, former minister of a Methodist church in Sylacauga, Alabama.
The Ku Klux Klan was revived after the Supreme Court decision in '54. They became very active in Alabama and many of the southern states in 1955 and 1956. Several bombings took place. The Montgomery bus boycott is a familiar story, but at the same time, I felt the first effects of the Ku Klux Klan in my home community in Alabama with the burning of a cross in February 1956. After the Supreme Court decision, there had been no legislation or action, so there was a vacuum which allowed them to reorganize, and they became a very threatening and intimidating force throughout the state. It so happened that at that time I was acting as president of the Alabama Council on Human Relations, a state interracial organization, and for many years had interracial services in my church with some criticism, but after '54 it became quite difficult, and after the cross burning in '56 it became almost impossible. For they used every type of intimidation. For instance, taking a very innocent statement which was made in one of our state meetings where I simply said we could have better race relations and solve our problems by patience and by discipline. They took that one statement, an excerpt from the paper, and on the opposite column produced their own leaflet implying that this was the propaganda of communists, of those who believe in mongrelization of the races, so that it appeared that even to work for better race relations meant that you were subversive. This was put out by tens of thousands across the state and in my own community, placed on telephone poles and in automobiles, subjecting my church to much criticism as though their minister was very radical when I considered myself a moderate. But any action was dangerous, supposedly. They likewise organized the telephone committees and having people around the clock to call your home, disturbing all hours of the day and night. Having a 17-year-old daughter and a 15-year-old son, they were subjected to much vulgarity, profanity. It should be remembered that much of this happened from people on the periphery of the city, people of very low social and economic and intellectual levels, but some of them religious fanatics and some of them criminals forming the Ku Klux Klan. But it thrived over the state. One thing which was very difficult to face, on my absence from the city on one occasion, they called my wife to tell her that my son, who incidentally was out double dating that evening, would be taken by the Ku Klux that night and they were going to tear him limb from limb. In about 15 minutes, a friend, so-called, called back to say, "I saw them take your boy. The Ku Klux put him in the car. You will never see him again." She was at home with a little 3-year-old baby boy, and thus did not know whether she would see him again or not. The police was called, but he was incapacitated and said he would be there the first thing the next morning. Fortunately, however, the young minister who assisted in our church found my son an hour later, not molested at all, out enjoying the evening, but it simply meant for an hour. My wife did not know whether the son was dead or not. That continued for over a year and a half until, burning another cross, my assistant minister kicked the cross over, and they threatened to kill him and my family too unless we left within 10 days. However, we waited that time out, and they did not do anything. Therefore, they somewhat lost faith. Our church and community stood behind us, reprimanded the Ku Klux, and thus we were able to live out the rest of the year without their intimidation. And it was only 6 months later at our regular annual conference that I accepted the other appointment.
Let's look at the organizations that lie behind such intimidations as Mr. Whitsett has vividly described. Actually, there have been a great variety of these groups, stretching on a continuum from the sadistically violent to the pseudo-respectable. At the violent extreme, of course, are the many Ku Klux Klans, with a combined membership estimated in 1960 to have been between 35 and 50,000, though they have steadily declined in strength since that date. The many separate Klan groups, some with such picturesque names as the Knights of the White Camellia, are concentrated in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee. Within these 5 states, they fight viciously among themselves for members, and incidentally for membership dues. Particularly vigorous is the competition between the 2 largest groups, the Georgia-based U.S. Klans, Knights of the KKK, and the loose confederation of local klaverns known as the National Knights of the KKK. Who would belong to such groups? What kind of people would dress in such an outfit? The mysterious sheet and the burning cross are mystic symbols of the one thing Klansmen have in common: the readiness to bomb, burn, and batter their native region in the name of white Protestant supremacy. In 1960, Klan leaders put it this way:
"If it takes buckshot to keep the black race down, Klansmen will use it. If it means burning schools to save 'em from integration, then Klansmen will burn 'em. If it takes saving the American way at the cost of our lives, then let's make that sacrifice."
These wild words were not empty threats. On one March Saturday in 1960, the National Knights celebrated their newly formed confederation by simultaneously burning over 1,000 crosses across 7 southern states. And in the Jacksonville, Florida race riot of August 1960, Klansmen armed with axe handles figured prominently, while in the January 1961 demonstrations protesting the desegregation of the University of Georgia, Klansmen were arrested with loaded guns. Moreover, it seems likely, in view of their leaders' public statements, that much of the bombing of Southern homes, schools, and churches is Klan-inspired. Dangerous as these modern Klans are, however, we should not make the mistake of thinking they will ever again achieve the mass followings their predecessors boasted in the 1920s and 30s. Nor should we confuse the present Klans with the original Ku Klux Klan, organized in 1867 by Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest. It started with a glowing preamble concerning chivalry, humanity, mercy, and patriotism, and a willingness to succor the suffering widows and orphans of Confederate soldiers. But just a few years later, it had become racist, and General Forrest attempted to dissolve it. And ever since, each rebirth of the Klan has held less meaning for the South than its predecessors, sharing with the earlier ones only the name. Look at what it had become by the late 1950s.
You know Eisenhower? In my opinion, he's supposed to be a Christian man. But a Christian man ain't gonna do what he's doing, or Nixon either, or the Supreme Court judges. Why, he's gonna love what God has created and not try to mix it up and mangle it up. These here oak trees out in the woods here, my friends, are just much oak trees they always have been. They always will be oak trees. They don't integrate with one another. Out here in the wild woods, the beasts don't integrate. My friends, the fishes in the river don't integrate. The fowls there, they still stay segregated. They got more sense than those Supreme Court judges up there and our leaders down here. Why, we got something down here.
The Klans are now the constant targets of public denunciation from all responsible Southern quarters. Indeed, the present Klans frequently get themselves into some ridiculous situations. For example, a Southern liberal friend of mine received a few years ago a call from a Klansman warning him that a cross was going to be burned on the lawn of his home within the hour. My friend suggested it would be less strain on both of them if they could bring one of their newfangled neon crosses, and he even offered them the use of his outside electric connection. Unperturbed, the Klansmen agreed on the condition that my friend return their expensive neon cross to them in good condition. But if the present-day Klans are pallid ghosts of their ancestors, other resistance groups, more pretentiously respectable and less openly violent, have flourished throughout the South. Though again, there are a variety of such organizations. The Defenders of State Sovereignty in my native state of Virginia, or the Patriots in North Carolina. By far the most important are the White Citizens Councils, organized by a young Mississippi planter named Robert Patterson in 1954, just after the Supreme Court school desegregation ruling. The Citizens Councils spread at one time throughout much of the South, but their strength has receded in recent years, and today they are strongest in Louisiana and Mississippi. Three characteristics of these councils are of special significance. First, the central organization in Mississippi divests itself of all responsibility for the actions of local groups, an ominous legal tactic that suggests the top leadership would not be too surprised if some of their local units occasionally broke the law. The second feature of the councils is their desperate striving for an aura of respectability. Not wanting to be confused with the discredited Klans, the organization claims that its leaders are drawn from the best people and that its program is necessary to prevent violence and racial hatred. Finally, their alternative to violence is charmingly simple. In addition to publicizing their racist views, the White Citizens Council simply use naked economic reprisals to enforce compliance and to suppress any expression of thought different from their own. Yet some members have resorted to Klan-like actions when these economic pressures proved insufficient, as in the late 1950s in Little Rock, where a number of White Citizens Council members were convicted of bomb throwing. Since the councils generally consist of a somewhat better educated and more influential membership than the Klans, they are in a position to attempt economic boycotts of national goods in some areas. They have boycotted national brands of cars, cheese, cigarettes, and beer. Because these firms sponsored television shows with numerous Negro performers, or because they gave money to national Negro organizations. And in local situations, their reprisals have led to scores of Negro teachers losing their jobs, Negro farmers losing their credit, and Negro merchants being boycotted by distributors. Sometimes secondary boycotts are employed by the councils. That is, say a milk company may stop selling milk to Negro customers who had signed a desegregation petition, because if it doesn't stop, it in turn would be boycotted by the Citizens Councils. No form of opposition is tolerated. Newspapers have been boycotted if they did not editorially support segregation. Relatives of Negro students who participate in sit-in protests have lost their jobs. Professors and deans in state universities who support desegregation have been dismissed. And even a white college student who wrote a pro-desegregation article for his student newspaper lost his part-time job. Clearly, these economic lynchings, like the old physical lynchings, have been designed to scare others as much as to punish a specific person or business. The editor of the Montgomery Advertiser objected to these procedures way back in 1954. At that time he wrote, "The manicured Kluxism of these white citizens' councils is rash, indecent, and vicious. This economic thuggery is rash because the Negro himself holds a powerful and growing economic power of his own. It is a two-edged sword that cuts wickedly in two directions." No prediction could have been more accurate. In fact, in Montgomery itself, the bus boycott of 1955-56 began to demonstrate the power of Negro Southerners to answer in kind. More complete and enthusiastic than those of the citizens' councils, the technique of whole Negro communities withholding patronage from racist merchants spread rapidly to Orangeburg, South Carolina, Tuskegee, Alabama, and other localities. Once the student sit-in movement for lunch counter desegregation began in 1960, the boycott was a perfected weapon and was usually needed to achieve the goals of the sit-ins themselves. In reaction, a number of states passed anti-boycott laws and applied them only to Negro organizations, of course ironic in light of the open boycotts of the white citizens' councils. But merchants report these laws have not brought back Negro customers. Thus, the South at times has resembled a complex quiltwork pattern of boycotts and counter-boycotts, as the predicted two-edged sword cuts wickedly in two directions. Now, to evaluate realistically the future of such resistance movements as the Klans and the councils, we must first recognize their strengths, even though they're not nearly as strong in the 1960s as they were in the 50s. First, these movements feed on genuine strains in Southern society. Their violent patterns draw upon the remnants of the region's violent tradition, a tradition stemming directly from the frontier and expressing itself in lynchings and high homicide rates down through the years. Moreover, their volunteers for violence can be drawn from the many uprooted whites who have come to Southern cities in recent years. These poorly educated, threatened people, finding urban life strange and militant Negroes even stranger, often provide the tinder for racist fires. Second, the resistance groups are especially strong in the old Black Belt plantation counties of the South. Such a location has considerable significance. The Black Belt whites have the deepest racial fears and bigotry, and offer fertile ground for racist exploitation. Likewise, Negroes are politically and economically weakest in precisely these same counties. Also, the Black Belt areas are vastly overrepresented in state governments due to their historical prominence and their refusals to allow population reapportionment. Consequently, the third strength of the racists, particularly the citizens' councils, is their control of state governments in the South. They virtually dominate 3 states, and they are powerful in others. Fourth, the racists have gone publicly unopposed in many white communities of the South because of the fears of Klan and council reprisals. Too few white Southerners have shown the courage of our guest, Mr. Whitsitt, and publicly countered their pervasive influence. Hence, many white Southerners who do not feel strongly themselves about race, but want only to conform, have had no alternative to follow but that of the racists. Note, however, that each of these resistance strengths is short-term in nature. The violent tradition of the South is dying out, and migrant Southerners are adjusting to city life. The Black Belt is rapidly shrinking in terms of both population and influence as out-migration of both races continues, and the political control and unopposed forum the racists have enjoyed are also waning. By contrast, the weaknesses of the racists are long-term in effect. After all, we are living in the 20th century, and all the trends of history are against these movements. For example, as desegregation progresses, reaching now into the cities of the very deep South itself, the racist arguments that it cannot happen, that Supreme Court rulings can be nullified with dynamite, these arguments have lost their ring. The inevitability of the process is rapidly becoming more evident to all. Or consider the effect of the steadily increasing Negro vote in the South. Relentlessly, this vote is eroding the very political base underlying movements like the White Citizens Councils. And as the Negro Southerners' buying power slowly increases, his counter-boycotts to council actions become ever more potent. The racist organizations have other long-term weaknesses too. All major religious bodies in the South officially support racial integration, causing the resistors to oppose constantly these highly respected institutions and to rely completely upon segregationist sect ministers with little authority. Likewise, the Klans and Citizens Councils repeatedly adopt ultra-reactionary political aims, which conflict with the basic interests of their less educated followers. Thus, their stands against organized labor and taxes and federal programs for low-income groups may ultimately contribute too to their downfall. The White Citizens Councils face yet another problem in maintaining their aura of respectability. On occasions, they've distributed anti-Semitic and fascist literature originating from outside of the South. Though in some areas, outspoken anti-Semites have been expelled from the organization. After one of these expulsions, the leader explained that the Citizens Council just couldn't afford to have anti-Semites around because he said that they were having a hard enough time just being anti-Negro. Now finally, all the racist movements share a fundamental weakness. They have no positive program, for they are all rearguard actions. Their wildly fluctuating memberships betray this weakness most openly. When major desegregation advances threaten, their numbers swell. But when desegregation is either not threatened or has been accomplished, their numbers dwindle. We've been looking at the ugly, contorted face of the South. But there are, of course, many other faces of the South. The friendly South with its easy charm. The busy South with its bustling community pride and its expanding industry. And in the long run, it is certain that these more winning features will prevail and in turn achieve a racially harmonious society. Indeed, the dwindling memberships of the racist groups in the 60s is evidence already of this. But in the short run, there is no denying the significance of the snarling resistance and reaction of Southern racists. Klan and Citizens Council mentalities still exist, even when the formal organizations have lost some of their force. This resistance has slowed the desegregation process, and it will impede it further, as long as it is tacitly tolerated or even invited by both public officials and many self-styled moderates. Yet this resistance has not, and it will not, halt the continuing progress toward equal treatment for all Americans. The real question is then, how much damage and suffering will the racists inflict upon their own region before submitting to the inevitable changes of our times?
There can be no gainsaying of the fact that that is a crisis in race relations today. This crisis has been precipitated to a great extent by the resistance of many reactionary elements in the South to the Supreme Court's momentous decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools. This resistance has risen to ominous proportions. There are still legislative halls in the South ringing loud with such words as interposition and nullification, and all of these forces have conjoined to make for massive resistance. In spite of this massive and determined resistance, the objective observer must admit that the Old South has passed away, never to return again. Many of the problems in the South today exist because there are still those individuals who are seeking to perpetuate a system of human values that came into being under a slave plantation system and which cannot survive in a day of democratic equalitarianism. Many forces are at work breaking down the old system. For instance, there is a great deal of industrialization going on in the South with a concomitant urbanization. As this industrialization takes place, it will inevitably break down the mores of white supremacy. Also hopeful is the fact that many persons in the white South are coming to see that bigotry is costly and bad for business. That is also the rolling tide of world opinion. Within the last few years, many new independent nations have come into being in both Asia and Africa. And as these new independent nations come into being, the leaders and the people are saying that racism and colonialism must go, and that they are making it clear that they will not respect any nation that will subject a segment of its citizens on the basis of race. And with this rolling tide of world opinion, the federal government will inevitably take a stronger and more forthright stand in breaking down the barriers of racial segregation. And I think that very few Southerners enjoy having the South lumped in the same category with the Union of South Africa as the last refuge of segregated power. Also hopeful is the fact that many human relations agencies are coming into being, and there are many persons in the white South who have a nagging conscience concerning this matter, and they are willing to work in many ways, sometimes in quiet and unpublicized ways, in order to implement the law of the land. But probably more than anything else, the determination of the Negro himself will break down the barriers of segregation and discrimination. For many years, the Negro passively accepted and adjusted to the conditions of segregation and discrimination. But today, in many ways, thousands and thousands of Negroes are making it clear that they do not like segregation, and they are willing to suffer and sacrifice in order to make integration a reality. This is the meaning of the student movement. This is the meaning of the numerous developments that are taking place all over the South. And I think with all of these forces working together, in the not too distant future, we will be able to see a desegregated society, and certainly most of the major centers and major cities of the South will be desegregated in the not too distant future. And I am sure that after the desegregation process, we will move on to a thoroughly integrated society in the not too distant future.